Welcome to Shelter in Solidarity, a deep dive with artists, activists, and authors during this ongoing global pandemic. I'm your host, one of your hosts today, Joe Ramsey, live casting here, Zoom casting, Facebook living with you from Dorchester, Massachusetts on the south side of Boston. And I'm joined, very pleased to be joined with a co-host today, Lena Durkin. Lena, are you there? Can we hear you?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Joe. I'm
Great.
so glad to be here. Very excited. Thank you.
Great. So glad to have you involved in this show in particular, Lena. As a recent graduate of UMass Boston and the Labor Studies program, you'll have a great perspective to share, I know. On today's show, Student Debt, Abolition Now, here on Shelter in Solidarity. We have a great group of guests assembled, activists, scholars, and activist scholars, scholar activists. We will have a panel of three folks to start the conversation for the first hour. And then as always, live Facebook viewers and live participants in the Zoom here an audience are welcome to join us around the hour mark. Just keep yourself muted until then. Our first speaker today, and in fact, we'll have a lively conversation, but I'll just introduce the guests all together and then we'll turn it over to Lena for our first question about student abolition now. First guest will be Jeffrey J. Williams. Jeff has spoken about, written on, and worked against the debacle of student debt since the 1990s. Real path-breaking scholar in this regard. His essays on the topic include The Pedagogy of Debt, Student Debt and the Spirit of Indenture, The Debt Experience, and Who's Responsible for Student Debt in Salon in 2021. Some of these are in his book, How to Be an Intellectual, Essays on Criticism and Culture. In academic precincts, he has helped build the new field of critical university studies, which turns theory to problems under our academic feet, criticizing the pernicious practices of the neoliberal university, degrading labor, enforcing corporate and financial protocols, reinforcing racism, and escalating massive debt. He also co-edits the book series, Critical University Studies from Johns Hopkins University Press, and is a professor of literary and cultural studies at Carnegie Mellon University. Jeff, it is so great to have you here on Shelter in Solidarity.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I mean, it's too bad, I think, as Astra was saying before, that we have to still keep talking about this, that it exists, but that this problem exists, but hopefully it will eventually end, soon end. Thanks.
That's true. That's true. Terrible problems bring great people together. So there is pleasure even amidst the pain here. In addition to Jeff, we have two terrific activist, scholar, authors involved in the Debt Collective. First, we'll have Jason Thomas Wozniak, an assistant professor in the Educational Foundations and Policy Studies Department at Westchester University, where he teaches education, philosophy, and history. Jason co-directs the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society, LAPES, and organizes, crucial for our conversation today, with the Debt Collective nationally and in Philadelphia, where he lives. Jason, thank you for being here today on Shelter in Solidarity.
Yeah, thank you, and pleasure to be here with everyone. So look forward to this.
Terrific. Really looking forward to it. Last but not least, we have Astra Taylor with us. Astra Taylor is an author, filmmaker, and co-founder of the Debt Collective, the country's first union of debtors. This is from their Debt Collective statement. They say, build power among debtors and their allies to turn individual financial burdens into a source of collective leverage that can be wielded to push for political and economic transformation. Astra's recent films include, but are not limited to, the 2019 film, What is Democracy? And the 2021 documentary, You Are Not Alone, the pun on alone and the loan, LOAN, which was produced with The Intercept, and I had the pleasure to watch that just before our show today, which is really great. I recommend it. Astra, thank you again for joining us today.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. Excited for this.
Terrific. Let's dive right in. Lena, take it away. You have our first question, kind of get into some of the history of how we got here. Take it away.
Yeah, so I'd like to start out this discussion by sort of having you all lay out the facts about how we got into this mess, basically, and exactly how this crisis has gotten to the point where over 45 million Americans are collectively drowning in $1.7 trillion of student loan debt. And with so many misconceptions and different kinds of myths surrounding student debt and its causes, and also what's to be done about it, I think it's just so important that we have a clear picture of, the actual historical and systemic factors that are at the root of it. And I hope we can start to dismantle some of those today. So I think we can start with Jeff and then go to Astra and Jason to get all your thoughts on not only the origins of student debt and how it's kind of developed over time, but also how both individual debtors and society as a whole are being harmed by it and who, on the other hand, is benefiting from it. So Jeff, if you want to start, and then we can go to Astra and Jason. Thank you.
Sure. So what specific question do you want me to talk about, how it originated, or do you want me to talk about how I got involved in it, or where do you particularly want me to start?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like to start with the origins, the history, the root causes, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
But you
that's
can
always
also
a
take
good
a stab at
question.
the other parts too.
Sure. And there's, it's important to know that there's a history to it. Because if you just graduated this year, you're probably, you're probably not even thinking about your debt yet because you don't, it's a ways off, right? But if you graduated 10 years ago, you feel like it happened very recently, or particularly after Occupy, there was so much attention to student debt. But I think then people think it's because of the crisis, the financial crisis of 7-8, that suddenly student debt became a problem. However, it started probably rooted very principally in the 80s, but it started because of the foment of the 70s that state universities were fairly cheap. And then there was pressure that we would usually call neoliberalism. There was a sort of reformation that, number one, through the 80s, there were cuts in public funds to higher education, but also the principle, the idea that things shouldn't be like a public entitlement, but it should be private choice, private responsibility, and handled in a market. So then therefore you had the increase of loans. And I'll give you one story. Actually, I went to Europe in 1982 and I could have gotten a charge card, but to get a charge card, you had to have a secured loan. That is that you could get a charge card with a limit of $500 if you had $500 in a savings account, but you couldn't, your limit was tied to your savings account. Suddenly loans got freed up under, we would always call it the Reagan era, but I think it's a longer era than that. And so you have unsecured loans, but through the 80s, then suddenly you have the shifting away from public support for higher education to private support, and that private support being individuals through loans. And as I said, it's actually the simplest way is it happened through policy. That is, it was people's choice at a certain point, and it happened very deliberately through policy. The policies they're a concatenation of things, but it happened through policy. But so, I could say more about even the exponential rise of loans, if you'd like, or is there anything you'd like me to pinpoint or, talk about specifically?
Yeah, no, sure. You can go right ahead with that. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, one way to think of it, I think, to think of it in terms of how much did debt go up. And the average debt in 1980 was around $2,000. Just at the 2020 dollars, that's about $7,000. Then it went up to about, by 2000, went up all the way, it spiked all the way through the 80s, 90s. By 2000, was about $19,000 was the average, which is about $32,000. Now it's about $37,000. So in other words, it came to where it is through the 80s and 90s. It's about the same as now. And what I like to compare that to is the price or the prices of new cars. The average price of a new car in 1980 was $10,000. That's about $36,000. The price of a new car, the average price of a new car in 2000 was about $19,000, but the same as debt. And that now is pegged at like 35. Average price of a new car is 30. So what I mean is the price of new cars stayed constant with inflation, whereas student debt went like this. So what I mean, part of it is to debunk the one myth that I would debunk is that, it's inflation, just costs went up, universities are spending too much. In fact, most universities are under retrenchment and continual austerity. So that's not really the case. But actually, if it went up disproportionately to everything else, so I think it was a deliberate policy to do that. And another myth to be dispelled is that it started with the financial crisis of 2007 or 8, but it actually had started because of this turn from the late 70s and 80s in policy that affected this turn in how money was apportioned.
Great, thank you. That was all really great stuff. Jason and Astra, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, maybe I'll even go further back. I mean, for people who maybe are listening to this at a later date, I think it's important to contextualize that today is the day after the Supreme Court decimated Roe v. Wade. So I'm thinking a lot, as many people are, about the Constitution and the nature of our so-called democracy. And it inspires me to think about the founding of this country and the founders' conception of debt and the politics of debt. So this is obviously not about student loans, student lending, but debt has long been a tool of racial domination and social control. And so there were various, categories of people that were deemed, unworthy of political rights. So women, the founding of this country, Indigenous people, Black people, this is a country founded on slavery, but also debtors, poor people. And so if you go back, there were big discussions at the founding of this nation about what to do if there was too much democracy and debtors revolted and demanded debt abolition. James Madison says, basically very explicitly, we can't have that. The wicked project of debt abolition is this phrase. And it was tied, as they understood, to wealth distribution, right? What would happen if the majority actually ruled and the majority are poor, or don't have as much means as the elite few? Well, if we have real democracy, then they're going to demand a redistribution of wealth and the cancellation of debts, and we can't have that. So that is there, at the founding of this country, along with a very conscious deployment of debt contracts as a way to dispossess people, to dispossess Indigenous people. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a governor of, I believe, Indiana. I might be wrong about that, basically saying, okay, bury Indigenous people in debt, and then when they can't pay, they'll be inclined to part with their land. And so this is, the through line of being aware of debt as a political tool and a tool of domination has always been there, and it's always been really explicit. And so that's why we saw the rise of sharecropping after the Civil War and emancipation. Okay, so we've got freedom on paper, but let's use debt as a way to, again, dispossess and to discipline. And so I think we have to see student debt as part and parcel of that. And that's where the neoliberal turn comes in. So, the neoliberal turn Jeff just described really was a reaction to an array of factors: falling profits, global economic crisis, inflation, but also to social movements making demands, to students protesting on state university campuses. And so again, there was a sort of disciplinary project there, as funding for state education was purposefully eroded and supplanted with lending, with debt, right? So instead of education being a public good people are entitled to, it becomes something you have to individually debt finance. And that completely changes your subjectivity. It changes your relationship to learning when you think, oh man, I'm going to be carrying this huge debt burden. How am I going to pay it off? What's my return on investment in education? And, I felt that disciplining profoundly as a young person. And for me, the story does begin with the financial crisis, because I was 28 in 2008 and I defaulted on my own student loans, and so I very much have felt the consequences of non-payment. But for me, I was like so many people caught up in larger economic forces and couldn't make my monthly student loan payments, defaulted. But at the time, I did feel the sense that, gosh, this is inhibiting for me from trying to do what I want to do with my life. So I was actually trying to make my second film, Examine Life, which is a film about philosophy. And, I wasn't making enough money as an independent filmmaker to pay my student loans. But I felt like the message from outside, I guess, was, well, as though I was supposed to prioritize my debt payments over my calling, my avocation, right? And I refused to do that, but I paid the price. But then when Occupy came to be, when Occupy manifested in 2011, I went there, and what I found out was, again, to quote the Debt Collective slogan, I was not alone. There were actually all of these other people. My student debt was very much connected to people's situations with medical debt, the fact that many people had underwater homes, and my political consciousness was really raised in that moment. But even more than that, there was an opportunity to start strategizing with others, including Jason.
Thank you so much, Astra. So much to think about there. Thank you. Jason, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I've said this before in private, but I'll say it again in public. I mean, I think Jeff and Astra covered it all, and always learn so much from them. So I actually don't have that much to say. I guess just to add a couple things. One would be, given the context that Astra introduced, I do think it's important to note, that 66% of the $1.8 trillion in student loan debt is held by women, according to the American Association of University Women's report. I do think it's important to speculate at least and think carefully about how that will impact struggles to come for reproductive justice. We know that debt is a way to impose labor and it steals our time. And so it's really hard to participate in movements if we're constantly working to serve debt. So I think that's worth considering as we enter into this really dark moment. And again, just I think to reiterate the points that have already been made, and maybe we can talk about this more about how student debt fundamentally transforms like educational experience and what it does to the notion of the public good, what it does to the ways that people study, what they study, how they can study. So perhaps we can get more into that as we continue on, and so I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a great segue, Jason. First, before taking it, I just want to thank you and Astra for marking the historical moment that we are in. This show is being recorded in the immediate wake of this despicable, in my opinion, and not only mine, Supreme Court ruling overthrowing Roe versus Wade as the law of the land. And in fact, I suspect, much to their credit, that many of our live audience that was particularly excited, I think we had about 100 people who were like excited and planning to come to this that we know of. I'm assuming many of them are out in the streets here in Boston and New York, some of the places where we have a following as well. They should be, and I aspire to join them once the show is wrapped. But nonetheless, important to make the links. These struggles are connected, and struggles for reproductive justice, both bodily and social, really do link these two issues in a profound way. And the feminization of debt, the disparities around debt, race and gender are important and have been flagged. So thank you both for doing that, since I hadn't. Picking up on the segue now, let's turn towards what Jeff Williams and others have called the pedagogy of debt, which I think also links to Astra's point a moments ago about debt as a tool of social control. I mean, I think there is finally a lot of discussion, relatively speaking, in our culture, even in its mainstream areas of discourse around, the effects of debt on people after they graduate, right? The suppressed ability to consume, to start a family, to have children, to purchase a home or even a car. This is getting more and more attention, as well it should, both at the individual level and perhaps for the society as a whole, the suppression of demand and so forth. But I think what is talked about less is the qualitative effect that debt, or high tuition and debt as the kind of the solution to that, the short-term solution to that for individuals, affects education itself. The qualitative difference that a debt finance system, an unaffordable system, even an unaffordable public system, affects on the education, even while students are getting it or trying to get it. And so I know that each of you can speak to this profoundly in different ways, but I think I would go to Jeff Williams once more to start, having written it literally an essay, which influenced me quite a bit back in the day, called The Pedagogy of Debt. And also having written, I think even before that, a very influential essay likening in a deep way student debt system to the system of indentured servitude, which was one of the key founding institutions of this society, in addition to outright chattel slavery. Jeff, could you talk a little bit more, and then we could go to Astra and Jason, about what you see as the pedagogy of debt, that is, and more broadly, perhaps, the way in which the presence or specter of future debt exerts pressure and kind of hollows out, in some sense, the very meaning of education, both even during higher ed and maybe even before, in terms of what happens to education and what happens to society as a result of the kind of financializing of educational experience. Jeff?
Sure. I mean, I was really struck how student debt affects us all. And let me put it this, let me say, there are a couple of ways to put that. Maybe the thing I'll start with, I'm going to tell you about my personal experience, but the thing I'll start with, I have a brother who was a grade school teacher. He told me the story that about little children were given this kind of quiz. It's like, what do green lights do? It's like, what do green lights mean? Go. What do red lights mean? Stop. What do yellow lights mean? Go faster. So the thing is, I think that they learn from the experience around them. And there are many justifications or rationale for higher education, right? on the one end, the more idealistic end, it's like self-improvement, self-discovery, self-exploration. On the more, the pragmatic or even venal end, or like for job. But still, presumably, it gives you a leg up on a job. But even that, with actually, if you have all of this debt, it's not even, it gives very different lessons. And I think it gives lessons about what you're actually doing there. It means that you're a token in a very consumer society, that capitalism is the way of the world that rules the world, and it's the correct way. It's the natural way. It means higher education isn't a social good, it's an individual good. It means that you're a function of human capital rather than it's being like a public collective. It means many other things, but it also then therefore changes your career and life choices, I think, particularly, as well as gives you a feeling in the world. I have one piece called the debt experience, or how it feels to be under debt. So I think it changes, in other words, it permeates, it runs through life. So I think that that's what's particularly pernicious about it. It's not, that's we think it's just a bill. Like you buy a car, you get your car payment, you pay it. And it's like, you want your car. So it's like you don't seem to mind and you have something for it. So we think it's a regular bill, but in fact, it's not. It permeates most of our whole lives. Now, to be fair, not everybody is under the same, strictures. That is, 30% or more people don't have debt. So it's very much a class separator or a function of class warfare, which I think Astra alluded to a bit. So 30% don't. Also, students that I have, they often get jobs like as an engineer making 90,000 the first year. So I don't think that they feel it. And they often come from wealthier families too. At a place like Carnegie Mellon, when I went to Stony Brook, it was very different. But here, so it's very uneven. And I think it's an inequality sorter that we have devised that it's particularly pernicious. I think it's literally like indentured servitude. When I studied indentured servitude, I didn't realize, people would use that as a very vague analogy or metaphor, but I realized in many points, it was almost exactly like a kind of servitude that you were indentured to. But it also means that many people don't have it. So that's what I mean. It's all about, it's a dispossession device because it dispossesses you of all the $1.7 trillion of 43 million debtors. It dispossesses them of that money, but who gets it? It's not just like it's to pay the bills because everything's expensive. It means, instruments like Sallie Mae or Navient, and one could go down a list, have made on average billions of dollars every year for the past 30 years. So, and I could talk more about indentured servitude and how that's very similar to give sort of the deeper history, but I'll pause there in case anybody else has anything to say or you have things to ask.
Yeah, Jeff, before going to Astra, I just want to say how much I appreciate you highlighting the class dimension, right? Which of course is often racialized in this society as well. But that, you have this pressure, right, on some people to pay that debt and to choose a career that can pay that debt. Whereas in the effect of that can mean that the only people who can consider going into the helping, serving, idealistic professions, that is those who aren't like suicidal like me and perhaps Astra in terms of pursuing their vocation regardless, right, are people who come from a certain level of privilege, right? So there can be a kind of, as you say, a class sorting, like, oh no, you can't afford to be a teacher, you can't afford to be an artist, you can't afford to be a philosopher. That's just for the privileged kids who can afford to come out with, with the 30% or less that can have no debt. So I think bringing class into this is important. And of course, as Astra has pointed out, one person's debt is another person's asset. So maybe Astra, you can speak to this too, the suppressed class kind of subtext of debt financial arrangements, but also just other notions of social control or what you consider the kind of negative pedagogy of debt.
Well, I just want to say, I actually really do want to hear more about the history of indentured servitude, because I feel like we always put our history to use in the debt collective. Absolutely. There's this idea, and I don't know the original source of the research, but that, college adds $1 million to someone's life earning potential. But of course, that assumes that you're, again, it reinforces that notion of human capital. Well, of course, that would be your main motive to attending college. But there's recently, just last week, a study circulating that Black women, because of wage discrimination, actually lose, just in terms of wage discrimination on the job, $950,000. So, right, they're already, it depends, college, it's always, who are you talking about? What populations, what class are you talking about? So you're already neutral. Black women are the most educated population, the most educated group in this country, and the most burdened by student debt. So Jason rightly pointed out that women hold 2/3 of student debt, while Black women, hold the most, and have because of these obvious factors, the lack of intergenerational wealth, again, the inability to accrue wealth that they can pay for the tuition up front. And, at a certain point, the math becomes a debt trap. That's the way compound interest works. And the programs that are devised by the government to fix this, so income-driven repayment programs that take a portion of your income every month, but extend the life of the loan some 20, 25 years with the promise of forgiveness that never comes. Just siphon wealth from people who desperately need it and from communities, because we're all individuals attached to families, to communities. As you pointed out, Joe, it means that people can't do other things with those resources. There's enormous opportunity costs. It's not just that, they can't, invest in property, which is supposedly the other pathway to the American dream. Maybe they can't afford daycare for their kids. I don't know. They can't afford to pursue their dreams, whatever those might be. So these are not abstractions to me. I mean, we spend every day at the Debt Collective talking to people who are trapped, and who, have see no path out of these loans and have no hope for retirement. I mean, these are just problems with our society larger. But I mean, people, one thing I often say is, people dream now. The American dream used to be owning a home, and now the American dream is having $0, right? I mean, just the idea that you'd ever be worth zero is an aspiration for so many of the people we work with, and that's really tragic. And so these debts are somebody else's assets. I mean, it's true. The loan servicers, we have, and that is neoliberalism again, these sorts of private public partnerships. So even though the vast majority of loans are held by the federal government, and that is a kind of, it's more the case after some Obama era reforms, loan servicers get a piece of that. They get juicy debt collection contracts, and they're making a lot of money off of this and are very happy with the status quo. And it seems like universities are pretty happy with it too, because then it doesn't enable their tuition financed model, and costs are rising, and the revenue from those rising costs are not equitably distributed in our opinions, right? Because of who they go to and the adjunctification of labor and all of that. So on the social control front, I mean, I think, what I'll just quickly say, what sort of got me thinking about student debt, besides being in student debt, I was actually writing my sort of thesis on social movements of the 60s. And it was the backdrop was the Iraq War. And there was a lot of discussion happening at that point. People saying, well, where are the protests, right? Why aren't the kids today like the baby boomers of yore and out in the street? And there were two reasons that were often given. One was, the absence of a draft, right? So instead we have a kind of poverty draft. Poor and working class people, often told they can go to college for free, are being recruited into the military. And the military is very explicit about this. The student debt is a recruitment tool for the military. And so this is why student debt is tied to gender justice, it's tied to militarism, it's tied to everything. This is not an isolated issue. And then the other reason that people often said, also student debt. In other words, the kids graduate from college and they're so worried about paying off their student debt that they aren't out in the streets protesting. I think what we've seen is that there was a brief period there where people thought that they could kind of honor that contract and do it, right? Like, okay, well, I'll just play by the rules. I'll pay off my student debt and maybe this will work out. And we're seeing why the debt collective is booming, I think, is people are just like, this is never going to fucking work. Like when we started the debt collective, student debt was, we protested one T-Day, the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion in 2012. We are literally planning for 2 T-Day because it's just around the corner. So, part of it is that I think in some ways student debt is losing some of its disciplinary force because people are just like, fuck, there's no way I can just keep my nose to the grindstone and pay this off and have any chance of having any security in life. So that is helping to radicalize people. And then what we're doing is providing a political analysis and a political home for them to hopefully engage strategically so we can attack this problem at the source.
Great, absolutely. And I do want to recommend to folks as well the Debt Collective collectively authored book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, which is where I did hear the Debt Collective making that point and quoting military recruiters on how, tuition costs and debt is actually a way of targeting and generating, free recruits, right? These kind of the way in which debt and just underfunded public services create kind of forced choices for people, right? While still trying to kind of interpolate them into the notion that they chose this, right? And therefore are responsible. It seems so crucial. Jason, I know the two speakers before you have done a great job of addressing the kind of negative, pedagogy, the repressive disciplinary pedagogies of debt, which we can still, and we will go back to Jeff in a bit for maybe a little more on the indentured servitude, Jeff, if you're ready to speak to Astra's follow-up. But Jason, I know you were interested also in kind of transitioning this into the question of what debt abolitionist pedagogy can or does look like, both in the classroom, but in society broadly, in the streets, not literally in the streets, but also just broadly in the streets, metaphorically beyond, the university or the classroom. So I would welcome you to speak to that as well, maybe to transition from further thoughts on the pedagogy of debt, but also the pedagogy of abolition. I mean, it seems clear to me from reading Debt Collective and watching your interviews that for you, debt abolition is not just a policy call, though it is that, or many different forms of policy calls, but also a kind of perspective shift, right? Kind of epistemological shift, as much as it is kind of a policy demand. So I don't know, Jason, I have some thoughts on this. I know you wanted to have a conversation with the collective here on the what debt abolitionist pedagogy can mean, but I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts to start.
Yeah. So just a couple other brief comments on the previous question. I do think it's important to note that when we talk about pedagogy, we're talking about both formally, like in schools, and informally outside of schools. And so like when you're growing up and as a kid, you see your parents struggling with bills and trying to put food on the table or put gas in the car and going into debt to do so. That's a form of pedagogy too. In other words, you're learning lessons there, as Jeff talks about, and those lessons are then guiding you in certain ways of life and ways of being. And, education, really briefly stated, is a form of shaping personhood or subjectivity, right? And so it's important to think of education as an experience. And if we think of education as an experience, then I think the key question is to say, how does debt transfigure or disrupt or really mess with that experience? And I think, as people have already said, they've given good examples of that. The other thing to say about this, I think there is something to be said about like this old theory by Bowles and Gintis of, correspondence theory, which is to say that schools are set up to reproduce the social relations of the political economy in which they're situated. And this is an interesting question for us to think about, because there's a lot of people that argue, and I think I agree with them, that today's financial capitalist economy is a debt economy, or in other words, like debt is at the heart of it, or the other side of the coin, credit too. So if that's the case, then one of the roles of school is to produce people that will fill their role in creditor-debtor relations and actually reproduce the social relations that financial capital needs in order to work the way it does. And so you learn these asymmetrical creditor-debtor relations from a very early age in schools, just through things like report cards. If you look at report cards, they're literally structured the same way that credit reports are. You get grades for doing certain things at certain times. Homework is in a way like a debt you owe that you have to pay back when you go back to school. In Portuguese, I speak Portuguese, it translates really well. Dever de casa means the work that you have, that you owe your teacher at home. So there's all sorts of different ways that like this creditor-debtor paradigm is set up long before we even take on like the financial debt associated with higher education that we've been talking about. Not to mention, it's really important to mention, and a good colleague of mine, Eleni Shermer, and some other folks in Commonwealth, we've been doing work on K through 12 schools are massively indebted. And that has an enormous influence on what happens to K through 12 education. So in the city of Philadelphia, for example, where I live, the district here is paying $300 million alone in debt service. That's $300 million that could be used for a variety of educational aims that is not going to happen. So I think that's really important to know. And finally, I think the last thing to say is like the way that debt really robs you of the time of study. I think a lot of us that are teaching now or we know that a lot of our students want more time to read, study, write, whatever, right? But they can't because they're working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet and or they're living in very precarious situations. And so they don't have time to really engage with some of the stuff that we would like them to. And I think that's something that we need to think about as well. So how debt robs the time of study. So all that said, and you kind of used a technical term that I think is helpful, Joe, not to get too deep into this, but you used the term interpolation. And I think, again, this is a long conversation. I'm gonna assume you're referring to like Althusser, but this way that we're brought into a dominant ideology. And I think this is an important point because I think one of the things that happens in education is that debt brings us into a certain series of debt ideologies, right? Like we become interpolated into certain debt ideologies, and those are both ethical, epistemological, ontological, all that stuff. And so we become these indebted subjects as we're interpolated into the dominant system, which is a debt system. So being that, and I think Jeffrey describes a lot of this in a lot of his work, but if that's the case, then the question I think as an activist and someone interested in abolition is to say, like, how do we counter interpolate that? In other words, like what would be, and I've learned a lot from my colleague David Backer on this, but like, how would you, and this is his words, how would you take up and take on debt ideology as an educator, as an activist? How would you like specifically address the dominant ideologies associated with debt in order to say overcome it or disinterpolate yourself? And this is a very difficult thing, but I think it's a really important thing that educators and activists do, and that we try and do, I think, a lot in the debt collective. And so I think what that means is to take up and take on the dominant like debt ideologies is to actually, do some of the debt pedagogy practices that we do. So for example, one of the most important, I think, counter debt pedagogies is debt testimony. I think these are lessons learned from like feminists of the past and present, but this idea of like giving debtors a chance to meet in one place, whether that be on Zoom or in the streets, to talk publicly about the debts they owe. And to do so in a way that doesn't produce the shame and guilt that's normally associated with an indebted life in this country. And once you start to do that, you start to, again, to come back to this phrase, you start to realize you're not alone. There's other debtors with you, and that's one of the first steps in building power, but also of overcoming this indebted subjectivity that we've kind of been hinting at. And so the debt testimony and the debt in what we call debt assemblies, I think are one of like the crucial ways of dealing with this in the streets, let's say. I also think it's really important that we address this in classrooms. I mean, maybe I'm optimistic, but if we take some of Marx seriously and Engels seriously, that the capitalists will create the class that will help dig, they're going to dig their own graves. One way to think about this is that we have like millions of debtors in our midst in universities. And what would it look like to politicize them against debt? And I think this is an explicit political project. Like this is an ideological project, but all education is ideological, so I don't have any problem with that. So I think this is to say, like, universities become a site of struggle against indebted life. And what would it look like to radicalize the students that are in our midst by taking directly, speaking directly to the way that higher education has been hollowed out, transfigured, whatever. And then what do we do about it? And so I think by doing having some of those conversations explicitly in our classroom makes a big difference. And along those lines too, I think pedagogically, we have to think of the ways that we reinscribe creditor-debtor relations. Whether that be through the way that we grade, whether the way that we hold people accountable that, again, are going through really difficult times for a variety of reasons. So I think we always need to be asking ourselves about this question of like, how are we also maybe not economically indebting people, although, I have to admit a good portion of my salary comes from the debt that my students take on. I think we need to ask this question about like, yeah, what practices can we do in classrooms as well that are going to help us, counter interpolate or undo indebted subjectivity?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I'm glad you brought up that point of, debt robbing study time, because I wanted to get into, I guess, kind of beyond and, well, in addition to the impacts of debt after graduation, also how just the prospect and presence of debt or future debt impacts students while they're in school. And we've already kind of talked about a little bit about how it impacts the educational experience, because, you know, it's either you're working so many hours, you don't have the time to fully immerse yourself in what you're learning, or you feel forced to study something that you don't really want to be studying or learning about or doing with your time. And I personally, I was someone that worked basically full time the entire time I was in school. And I did graduate with no debt. And I know that well, I guess lucky doesn't feel like the right word, but lucky to graduate with no debt. And I'm in the minority in that. But yeah, I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts on that side of the problem, because I feel like it's not quite as talked about as much. And maybe for our debt collective guests, sort of what the debt collective is doing to address the needs and concerns of working class students and students who are working during or throughout their education, and also how that kind of adds yet another layer to why we need tuition-free education as well. And whoever wants to jump in, feel free to just unmute and go ahead.
Well, a couple of things I would just say that the one thing about the debt system, it's so variegated. That is, it's different for, like, there's different spectra of it. Like at state universities, community colleges, the level of debt is probably higher, although the tuitions are cheaper. Whereas at like fancy places, it's often debt free. But it's also variegated in a few different ways. That the one thing I think we have to bring in, you mentioned labor. At the average, I believe I saw the most recent study was that people at state schools, public universities, and colleges work 25 hours a week. And then some people, I think now you probably have political tension with it. I mean, we will see political tension because somebody who went, say, I've had students who worked 40 hours a week, and they're almost resentful if people are forgiving debt because they feel like, well, I busted my ass and I had to work this whole time. But, you know, they're part and parcel. They're just paying it. I mean, debt, after all, is future labor, right? That's part of the indenturedness of it. So that's one part of it. The other thing I wanted to mention too, there are private loans which aren't as accounted for. They're about 8% of the loans, so it's like 120 million or billion are in private loans. But the other thing are plus loans and family funding. So it like takes a village, debt captures a village. That is that there are many parents, I believe that plus loans are in the low 100 billions, but that, you know, that's a lot of money, but also even like second mortgages, savings accounts. So what I mean is the web is, it's not just, you know, onto the one person of the student, but it brings in their families, their friends, their loved ones, and other people that they encounter. So, I mean, that's another dimension I think that we should add. And it's so uneven. I guess that's what I mean. It's an uneven system. So, you know, I summarize it all the time, but it's very different from going to state university. When I went to college, I went to Columbia. No debt. My father worked in a cement plant. I had a very good, you know, it was actually need-based, which many of the Ivies still are. I left because I had a daughter and I eventually raised her by myself. And I went back to Stony Brook, and it was a very different experience in the late 80s. Then I had to take a bit of debt to do that. And then through the 90s, even, you know, the debt just kept going up because the interest was so high. And the other thing is you don't really realize your debt. And I find with my students, you know, I'll bring it up in class. They're aware of it, but I don't think you feel it until you're out a couple of years and you start paying it. And then because you have those forbearances and it's a little bit fictitious. And you also think, you know, I mean, they do studies about people are usually much more positive than about their outcomes, you know, and hence that, you know, they think, I thought I would pay mine off by the time after I had my job after 5 years. It took me 20 years. And so I think, and, you know, I'm one of the lucky ones, presumably. So in that regard, but, you know, then it permeated everything else too. I never have owned a house or an apartment or anything like that. I've only rented. And so, you know, it trickles through lives. But what I mean is there is a wide and uneven spectrum to talk about. So hopefully that wasn't too disorganized, but just add a few other elements.
I think that's really important. And before we redirect this to Astra and Jason on this, you know, debt abolitionist pedagogies, both existing and I guess other possibilities the debt collective is thinking about, and and others. I just wanted to flag one aspect that I think Jeff was touching on. I mean, going back to Jason in terms of the question of how to confront or help people to shed dominant ideologies, or to put it in that Althusserian theoretical language, the kind of counter interpolation, right? Getting people to identify or disidentify from what they've been expected to kind of take on as a subjectivity. I think about time and space, like David Harvey, others says, like, capitalism doesn't solve crises, it just moves them around. And I wonder, one thing I think about, and I think about this as a contingent faculty organizer as well, and thinking about the kind of the ways in which graduate students and contingent faculty could work together in ways they often are, the system kind of keeps us apart, is to say, how can we bring the future into the present? Right. But then also, how can we fight against the kind of spatial displacement of debtors? I mean, one of the systematic like advantages of a debt system is, like, one of it is, like Jeff's point, like, students often don't feel the pain of it. If they have made the choice to not work 40 hours and take debt, then they can have this like illusion, this appearance of freedom, which is not entirely an illusion, because it might mean they can actually read the whole book instead of the cliff notes. Although Lena somehow bucked the trend, worked 40 hours and read the books, as far as I can tell. So there are exceptions, right? But and I'm sure she had help to do that, to be able to do that, right? But not to lose my train of thought, but this question of, the system can kind of give you the sense of deferring the pain, right? Deferring, and then of course, once it hits you, right, just kind of like the person who gets a PhD and wakes up, there is no tenure track job in their field, but once every 5 years out of 1,000 candidates, by the time you wake up and feel the pain, you're no longer like proximate to the institution that is kind of, that has the power, or that, that seems to have the power, and you're separated from your cohort of graduate students, like the collectivity. Even if you were part of that graduate student union, you're really feeling the pain that would make you fight for healthcare rather than paying out of pocket, like 5 years, 10 years later. And that is obviously a deficit for organizing. So I wonder to what degree it's helpful to think about kind of temporality and spatiality here. I've also had this fantasy that we could have like a take your debts back to campus day, where like alumni go back to the institution that gave them their debt, linked up with current faculty and students, and like hold debt rallies, kind of, bust it, like, maybe make it like alumni weekend or something, right? And similarly, the idea of putting future debtors in conversation with people who don't have it yet. And I think Jason's point about even K-12 being haunted by this is important too, because, like, again, if tuition wasn't so high, and if debt wasn't so scary, like, how would that change K-12 education, right? Like the whole like idea, like, you better fucking like get all A's or else you're never gonna get a scholarship, and you're never gonna, like, that would change too. So I feel like what we can do to like be conscious and mobilize around the temporal dispersal and the spatial dispersal of this, I think that seems like a challenge, to put it mildly. But sorry to go on too long, but I have been living in, I got my 6 figures of debt too, so I have some right to speak, I think, on this one, besides the degrees on studying the shit. So anyway, I'd love to turn it back to Astra and Jason, and maybe soon, we're getting close to the hour mark, the whole group we have here, in a little bit, to talk about that abolitionist pedagogies and basically organizing strategies, which I think we'll get more into soon as well. And
yeah, well, that was good testimony. You just did what Jason said. So, I mean, I'm a weirdo. I didn't go to school as a kid. I was raised by parents who subscribed to a philosophy of unschooling or deschooling, and who so that's my background. So it was, and they also so in that sense, I think, the points people are making about the way conventional schooling kind of inculcates this ethos of, the good, tries to train people to be good debtors. And be part of being a good debtor is accepting you're to blame, right? We know that debt, as David Graeber liked to point out, the German word for debt means guilt. And so imposing this, what we call a phony morality of debt, so that people feel bad. So I think I was raised, part of the unschooling ethos is an ethos of entitlement. You're entitled to really learn. You're entitled to follow your curiosity, and you're entitled to, not to learn, not in fear of being punished. I always think it's again, I have had very little formal schooling compared to most people. And I always think it's really interesting. We call them disciplines. And, people at school, people are disciplined. I mean, I think, and that's part of the confusion traditional schooling imparts for folks, right? Is like that there's so much punishment. And Anyway, so I think, you know, so I'm not coming at this as an academic. I'm not a teacher, and my mode of engaging in pedagogy has been through my organizing and through my filmmaking and through my writing, and through the movement I'm trying to build. I think it's really important to say that the Debt Collective is not just a student debt organization. We are responding to the financialization of the economy, and we are trying to change the political economy of this society. And we see all of these debt types as connected. So we are working on carceral debt, we're working on rent debt, we're working on medical debt, right? Because these debts, as Jeff said, the household is implicated, but the household has many kinds of debt. And what we call student debt is sometimes a second mortgage on the home, right? You know, what we call credit card debt is actually your medical bills. So actually this is quite, these are all interconnected. And there's definitely a temporal and spatial dimension to this. And so we're trying to take the challenges of debtor organizing and turn them, I think, to our advantage in some ways. So I guess on the temporality of debt front, I would say, yes, it's, you know, theft of future wages. We say that we describe student loans as a way that people have to mortgage their futures, right? It's a claim on future wages. So definitely it's, and so I think it's exactly right that people don't feel their student loans as much when they're in school. So people sometimes project onto us that we must be organizing students. The truth is people come to us typically in their late 20s, 30s, up into their 70s. We have many older members, because that's when people start to really realize like, oh, wow, this isn't working out. People do, I think, tend to overestimate their ability to get out of these debts when they are incurring them. I think as we do this public pedagogy, though, we start politicizing that is changing. So we are seeing younger people gravitating to the movement. We're seeing more students. We're seeing high school students organize. There was a walkout of high school students in Wisconsin a month ago or so, walking out over the fact that they were going to have to go into debt for college. So that, you know, that's a change in political consciousness when people start protesting the debt before they have it and not decades into it. So I think that shows how much the sort of discourse around student debt has evolved. You know, debtor organizing is different than labor organizing. Labor is, you know, typically, not always, but a lot of jobs happen in a workplace, in a hospital, in a school, in a factory, and you are organizing with your colleagues against the boss. The advantage of debtor organizing is that, you know, you can organize as part of the debt collective, whether you're unemployed, whether you're precariously employed, whether you have 3 jobs, whether you're in school and taking a break from employment, whether you're retired or, you know, semi-retired, because your debt sticks to you, you know, wherever you're going, whatever category you happen to be in life. The challenge of it, though, is that, well, you're not in the same place. So you have to find each other. And then you have to figure out who your common creditor is. And so the thing about student debt, and I guess this is the last thing I'll say, to your point of imagining people returning to campus, the thing is, again, because so much of student debt is federally secured, the common creditor for that, the political focal point, is the Department of Education. So student debt, one reason we have focused so obsessively on student debt is because there is one clean target, the Department of Education. And through our research, we uncovered that they have mechanisms to erase the federal debt they hold. So one is called borrow, defense, repayment, and that is how we have at this point won billions and millions of dollars of relief for for-profit students who were defrauded. And also an authority called compromise and settlement that's in the Higher Education Act. It's basically, hey, if you issue debt, you don't have to collect it. And so that, so organizing by creditor, you know, can be tricky because it's obscured, but it can connect people across space based on their present and future interests.
A quick word on the time question. I think it's interesting that, and Astra and I have talked about this before, but the word school comes from a Greek word skole, which kind of comically meant or means free time, or a suspension. And so the idea, and obviously there's problems with this notion, right? But the idea that school was a place to suspend some of the pressures of outside life in order to be able to think and contemplate. Otherwise, obviously, we've never really accomplished that, especially during, you know, since the rise of industrial capital. But this idea, I think, of suspending the pressures of indebted life even if momentarily, is really important. And I think if you rupture the rhythms of indebted life and give people a chance to contemplate life otherwise, that has some impacts. And at Debt Collective, myself and some colleagues, we created a whole series that we called Jubilee Schools, where we did like political education around debt. And one of the reasons why I think people enjoyed it so much wasn't necessarily because of the content of what we were teaching, although that's important, but it was just an opportunity to get in a room with everyone, or like in a Zoom room, whatever, and to like contemplate life otherwise, and to like take a break from serving debt, of serving some of these other pressures, and to have a chance to like cultivate political imagination. And so that might sound a little bit idealist, but I think it's really important for us to think about like how there needs to be moments, there needs to be ruptures in indebted life to like imagine something different. And I think that we as educators and activists can provide that.
Yeah, that's great. Jeff Williams, do you want to speak to this? Thoughts on kind of resistance strategies, pedagogical strategies, understood not only in the school setting but beyond, or I know that Astra and Jason have spoken to this quite profoundly.
Sure, I can mention a couple of things. I mean, the one thing that I've recommended all along is, like, I do teach the university, or I teach critical university studies. I have for a long time, because it dawned on me that, I mean, let me put it this way, that so when I went to graduate school in the late 80s, it was the theory years. And I was taught by, some excellent people. I mean, my mentor, Michael Springer, was a great Althuserian Marxist. And, I think he was an admirable figure. But in a way, I was always amazed that people would have these very elaborate theories of politics, but not really talk about the university itself that they were in, not to mention they weren't aware of, because they didn't have debt, what it was like to grow up with debt. And at Stony Brook, all of my graduate crew, it's pretty working class. It's very different than Columbia. And and everybody ended up there because we had better scholarships or something like that. You could actually afford to go there and to live there with your grad stipend or something like that. And so, I was particularly struck that they didn't really know, despite seemed to be, not a disparity, but a distance between the kinds of things they were talking about and what we were actually experiencing and undergoing. Because as I said, I and all my students, we had debt, or we didn't have necessarily good conditions. Plus we had to worry about getting jobs. Not everybody got jobs. And, there were some, actually quite sorry stories about what happened to people who went through there. So I guess that's one element. So it was beholden to me. So I tried to figure out what the university was about, and, study the history of higher education, part the reproduction theory that Jason referred to about Bowles and Gentis and things like that. I like the struggle theory better than the purely reproduction theory, which I think is what we're probably all talking about. The other thing is some of the things that have been affiliated with one time was Adolf Reed had free higher ed, which he still advocates, even though the Labor Party that advocated it is defunct. Also, this guy, Alan Collins, who's sort of, he's in a way outside of academia, but he very much has lobbied for, he has a group called studentloanjustice.org. You have to be careful that you don't look at, I think one of the other sites that's very similar to that is for a banking enterprise. But he has a whole bunch of accounts of people having student debt. And he had done it a long time ago. And he himself has a book called The Great Student Loan Scam. But he really harps on bankruptcy. And Asher was talking before about the history. And so America's always had the structure of debt, but it also had a structure of bankruptcy. I think that there are books by like Lepore and other people about that famous figures like Benjamin Franklin declared bankruptcy 2 or 3 times or something like that. Or former President Trump, didn't he declare, or some of his businesses declared bankruptcy, but that people used bankruptcy, but actually with student debt, bankruptcy rights were stopped, I believe, in 78 or 79. And, it's no pleasure to declare personal bankruptcy because it takes 7 years to get your credit back. You can't get a credit card and things like that. So, it makes things like travel hard. But there are other impetuses like that, because even simply, I myself wonder if it could be declared by bankruptcy, then I think it would change. I think from the financial side, they would change quite a bit. And one thing I would mention about that, I don't know that financial enterprises are averse to ending debts. They just want the debts on their books, as oddly as, maybe Astra and Jason could speak to this better than I could. But if they have a debt, it's like if you get a car, they'll encourage you or sometimes require you to take a loan for a better price. And you can pay it off after a month. But because then therefore their banking enterprise has a certain amount of money and their profits and value is accrued by how much money they have on their books. So if after 20 years it goes away, it's actually not a problem because you have been an asset for those 20 years where that debt has been an asset. But anyway, that's also something else to think about. But the fourth thing that I would suggest, other than like teaching and bankruptcy, there's other things. I'm intrigued with this idea of liability. And it became more, and I wrote a couple of pieces about it. One was in Salon last summer, but that if you look at liability, it especially came to the head with the Sackler enterprise, which I believe had a settlement. Now, there were a lot of people who made money, including the founders of, the people who took Sallie Mae private, who made billions of dollars, literally. And maybe they should be liable for the harm that's caused in a civil action rather than a criminal action. That if they did policies that badly affected people, just like drug companies, drugs are presumably for good use. So however, if you're selling them and they have poor effects for people, aren't they liable for those things? So I think there's the one frontier is to talk about liability. That seems a bit far-fetched, but in 1997, I thought that free higher ed was far-fetched, and then the past 10 years, it's suddenly been on the table. So.
Yeah, I'm so glad that free higher ed has been mentioned a couple of times here. I think that's very important. And obviously, I know that's an integral part of the debt collectives kind of program as I've read it. And I think it warrants emphasizing because there is a kind of, divisive kind of rhetoric that tries to pit. I think that Inside Higher Ed had a poll they talked about a couple of weeks ago or a few days ago, maybe saying, oh, most people would prefer cheaper tuition rather than debt cancellation, right? It's like as if you can't have both. Right. And clearly, debt collective and others such as myself and progressives in the union movement, like in higher education, Labor United, I want to mention another group that's, I think, important in this fight, are calling for both. Right. It's not either or. I want to flag as we are just past the hour mark that for our live audience, and I know we have a bunch of people watching on Facebook, one of whom has shared a question here via text. We are going to kind of start to bring in audience voices very soon. I think I'm going to kind of pose one more question, and Lena is going to actually share that Facebook question as well in just a moment. Lena, I think maybe first I will just add my piece and then we'll let Ben Stork, a longtime supporter of the show and sometimes guest, have his question read aloud by you. But basically I want to flag this question of leverage, particularly for the debt collective folks, but also for Jeff Williams. One of the kind of linchpins of the debt collective's statements are often is like turning your, individually, the economic situation of a debt is very oppressive, but if we collectivize that, it can be turned into a source of leverage and power, right? You talk about economic disobedience. We also, of course, talk about political advocacy. I'd like to hear you talk more about what you see as the leverage and the different types of leverage that debtors or those working in solidarity with debtors have, and also but also to foreground maybe a little more than often comes up in these conversations, obstacles to that, specifically drawing on my own personal experience as someone who, with some level of political consciousness and perhaps legal naivete, stopped paying loans a long time ago and has subsequently had them not only go into delinquency, but into garnishment, right? So basically, I have discovered the hard way, as I suspect thousands, if not millions of others have, that at least certainly government held loans, but perhaps even privately held loans, most of mine are through the government on some level, that these collectors can come with a court order and come and just take the money from you directly up to a certain point. I think there is a legal limit there around 15%, at least in Massachusetts. I don't know if that's true federally, but nonetheless, I'm paying like another layer of taxes, which of course has been on pause for this moratorium period, thank goodness. And I felt that. But essentially, I've discovered the hard way that refusing to pay does not necessarily mean that they won't take it directly out of your hide, at least if you are working on the books. I suppose one way to avoid this would be to just work cash jobs or something or leave the country. So I kind of wanted to dig in to get you to talk more about this question of leverage. And maybe I think when we go to Lena relaying Ben Stork's question, we can talk also about the targets, so in the difference between kind of public and private targets for kind of using the leverage we have, and of course the different kind of leverage we might have with respect to one sort of institution versus another, and the political opportunities or dangers or obstacles of that. So yeah, I want to ask about just like leverage in light of the kind of power, like what can we do basically in light of the powers of collection that these institutions often have, and what perhaps can we do to counter those powers that they have? Maybe that would be precisely a new front of the struggle. Lena, could you relay Ben's question too? Not that I didn't give them enough, but I think it does add another angle.
Yes, so this is from the Facebook Live. I believe I will read it. It's from Ben Stork. So given the conversation around social control, ideology, social reproduction, and debt pedagogy, how does this affect strategies and tactics around debt abolition in relation to the larger framework of capitalist society? That is, the push so far tends, because of the role of the federal government in student debt, towards legislative and other appeals to the state, even in militant actions like debt strikes. At some point, does this struggle need to move away from directing our strategy toward so-called public institutions and more toward direct antagonisms with capital, i.e. not strikes? Sorry, it's kind of hard to scroll on here, i.e. not strikes to push pressure on officials who manage debt, but towards the debt relation as such, something like not asking for forgiveness or demanding the relief, but simply refusal of the relation itself.
All right, so do that in 5 sentences or less.
Well,
no,
I mean, I think Joe, you've really said, you can't refuse the relation itself when they're garnishing your wages and your Social Security. So you can want to exit capitalism, but it's a hard thing to do. There's no, so I'm organizing from the position that there is no escape or pure refusal. And I'm very conscious of the risk that you just laid out. As I said, I was a student debtor, defaulter myself. So for example, with my default, I didn't have my wage garnished, but my principal ballooned 20% overnight. So their punishment for me was to say, okay, you can't pay, so now you owe more, and that's standard. In some states, defaulting on your student loans can mean that you lose your licensure. So in other words, you will lose your job that you're supposed to pay debts back with. You can lose your driver's license in some states. So there are serious risks. Again, we are not just a student debtor organization. So strategy depends on the debt type that we are talking about. And private student loans demand a different strategy than federal student loans. Again, the majority of student loans are federally backed, but bankruptcy, you have no bankruptcy protections for either of them. It was actually Joe Biden's 2005 bankruptcy reform that whittled away the last of the bankruptcy protections for private student loans. So this is a very specific, special kind of debt. You can declare bankruptcy for anything else, not your student loans. It's also special in the sense, again, that the Department of Education, that this federal agency is core, is the holder of the debt and the debt collector, and has this ability to cancel it. So our strategies right now that we're working on to challenge bail debts are different than the strategies we're working on around medical debt, different than the strategies we're working around rent debt, right? Where the targets there are, entities that are more in the private sector, though the state is always implicated in financial contracts here. Really concretely, I think organizers have to figure out, what kinds of power do we have? What kind of leverage do we have? We have the leverage of public opinion in some ways, right? That's why we've done so much work on pedagogy, on public imagination, on delegitimizing debt. And we have made enormous progress in terms of these things being on the table, discussions of free college, discussions of debt cancellation, right? Just shifting public consciousness and trying to inspire this sense of entitlement. And again, delegitimizing debt and challenging the phony morality around it. Then there is the role of sort of economic strategies, strikes, strategic non-payment, and that's going to be different, again, depending on the debt type. We are in a federal payment pause right now. So actually, it doesn't matter if you strike your debt because people aren't paying their federal loans. What this has done, though, is proven something that I think is important for the public to take in, which is the government doesn't need our student loan money, right? Like the sky hasn't fallen. This revenue is not essential. In fact, in their calculations, are already expecting a lot of it not to get paid back. And so, you can, if you can pause it for a year, you can pause it for 2 years, it's going on whatever, 2.5 now, you can pause it indefinitely. But holders of federal student loans are in a unique place because they don't have that kind of direct economic leverage. And, you are going against the state, which has extraordinary powers of collection. So then what other leverage is there? Well, there's legal leverage and there's political leverage. And so this is why we've done a lot of work around figuring out what actually are the laws. And it turns out what authorities does the government have? And they have a lot of authority to cancel these debts that they hold. And so I think for student debt, it is a political fight, because one man, the president of the United States, can sign an executive order and make every penny of federal student debt disappear. And so that's the nature of this fight. Other fights will have different targets and involve different strategies. This has, it's an interesting time to be talking about this because we just had a historic victory. The debt collective has its roots in Occupy, but we really sort of crystallized in 2015 when we launched the first ever student debt strike, working with students from a collapsing predatory for-profit college called Corinthian Colleges, Inc. Everybody thinks student debtors go to Harvard. Well, only a few thousand people do. 100,000 working class people a year, not kids, adults, veterans, single moms, disabled people, funneled into these for-profit colleges that spend all their money on advertising. So, the community college might be a few miles away, but it's not phoning you 20 times a day and using lead generation on the internet to get you to sign up and then charging you sometimes $45,000 a year tuition to go to school online, like these schools are. So Corinthian was enrolling 100,000 people a year through its three schools. Various state attorneys generals were investigating it. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was suing it. And the Obama administration was basically bailing it out by trying to rebrand it and have it be bought by a nonprofit company that was actually had no experience of education, but had been a debt collection agency. And so the debt collective started organizing with students who, their federal loans had been maxed out, they're buried in debt, and they're working at Walmart, fast food jobs, right? And so we did it again. The options are they're not allowed to declare bankruptcy because that they have student debt, and they're not allowed to sue the school or engage the school in any way because they sign arbitration clauses when they enroll, right? So you sign away your legal rights. And we did a lot of work with them saying, okay, well, certain avenues are just closed. A lot of you are already not paying your debts because you literally can't at these minimum wage jobs. So a lot of folks were already suffering, their credit scores were already destroyed. And we said, you can politicize that, declare yourself on strike, and go head to head with the school. And then also we, through legal research, found some lawyers who had uncovered this little known provision of the Higher Education Act that's from the 90s, actually, called borrower defense to repayment, that says if a school violates state law or otherwise commits fraud, people are entitled to loan cancellation. But the government had never told people how this provision worked or how to assert their rights. So 5 eccentric people had tried to make these claims. They're called borrower defense claims. We came along, we built an app so that people could do it. We sort of guessed as to what it would be. We built an app that people could use at home on their phones because the people we're working with didn't have computers, let alone printers. And we flooded the Department of Education with ultimately tens and tens of thousands of claims, caused a crisis, and forced the Obama administration into a rulemaking session. They started issuing relief, which then Betsy DeVos tried to fight. It was her top priority, was rolling back this progress. So anyway, a month ago, the Biden administration basically ceded to the strike's demands. Our demands initially were cancel all student debt, cancel all the debts that every student from Corinthian owes automatically without delay. Well, they delayed for 7.5 years and screwed people over in a big way. But nevertheless, they just erased $5.8 billion of debt belonging to 560,000 people, using the mechanism we uncovered and doing what these strikers said. And then day before yesterday, the day before the horrible SCOTUS announcement, they canceled another $6 billion using the same mechanism for another 200,000 people. So, this is absolutely the power of collective action, of people saying together we have power. And that power was multifaceted. It was the power of public opinion. We went out there, we got support ultimately from something like a dozen attorneys generals, support from, more liberal political figures, but also just the public. It was legal. There was a militant strike at a point where when there wasn't a payment pause. So, in the end, hundreds and hundreds of people joined the strike. Forced the administration, forced two administrations who did not want to issue relief, three administrations who did not want to issue relief to do it. At one point, Betsy DeVos was forced to honor some claims. And when she did this, she signed her name and wrote a note next to it with extreme displeasure. So even Betsy had to cancel some of this debt. So that's what we're always just like, let's keep going. Imagine if there were more of us and we were more militant and we were even, but we have to be open to the fact there's not just one trick that can do it. We have to be creative and use every shred of leverage at our disposal.
Yeah, I think that's really important clarity, just right, because it's not just flipping the economic position of the dettee directly. It's really about kind of the politicization of that, it sounds like, and then the deployment of a kind of collective political energy, both in terms of public opinion and legally, where that's open to kind of, at least in this case, to marshal the force. It's not simply like the withholding of the analogy of withholding labor power. It's more like, it seems to be more like a symbolic kind of subjective transformation that then it can go, then that energy, once you have it, right, you can kind of direct it in different against different institutional levers, right? Based on
labor unions don't just strike willy-nilly. They take years and years and years to build a strike. You build solidarity. You ultimately organize. If you have a sort of social movement unionism, you organize around other demands that the community has. You treat people, as whole people, not just as workers. And the strike is, just like labor organizing, debtor organizing isn't just the strike. You have to have, and obviously there's legal facets to labor fights and all of this. All good organizing campaigns are multifaceted, I think.
Absolutely.
But labor strikes, they have a beauty about them, which is, you can sit in at the, you can block work in a way it's hard, and that's easier, I think, than blocking the flow of capital, especially when, again, they have these powers of garnishment and stuff like that. But both require a lot of creative thinking about what power you have when you're disempowered.
Absolutely. And to speak as if most American labor unions talk about the strike as the core, is a bit of a fantasy, although I do feel like it's making a comeback, at least as a horizon of possibility. Right. I know Jason unmuted and wanted to speak to this as well before I overtalk. Yeah, go ahead.
Just really quick. Recently in the last several months, we've made a concerted effort to get labor on board by saying that debt is a labor issue. And we've really pushed that over the last 6 months. Some of us created a document listing 10 reasons why, and we've been circulating that. But I just really quickly, on the one hand, if you can win wage increases, but if those wage increases are going straight to your creditors, then okay, that's not a huge win. It does also, again, this question of time, where your labor time is used to pay your debts. And then it also gives us less leverage when we go to bargain contracts, because as debtors, we're in a weaker position. And so we have to accept certain terms that are, not ideal. Just really quickly to the other question, I think one thing that for me, it's a huge conundrum is to say you can be anti-debt, but not an anti-capitalist. And I think this is a tricky issue, because how do you move from being anti-debt to being anti-capital sometimes is a big question. To be frank, I think a lot of people, rightfully so, want to be included into the system. And one way to do that is to get rid of your debt. And so I think there's a huge issue there about how to radicalize the person that's anti-debt. And I think that takes a lot of work. But I do think that debt has always been, and we've talked a lot about this, I think, in the Debt Collective, as a way to get to the heart of racial capitalism, as something that you can use to really, uncover the ways that racial capital exploits and expropriates and et cetera. And so it's one way that we maybe get people talking about racial capital in a more critical way.
Yeah, no, this is really, really great stuff. And I that's very exciting, Jason. This prospect of having labor unions and coalitions of labor unions more kind of conscious of and kind of integrating demands and concerns around debt into their, campus or workplace organizing. I think that is really I think that could be really powerful, right? I mean, you could see kind of disruptive workplace activity even that was raising debt. I'm thinking of campuses, of course, right? That was linking campus labor and students and alumni, right? That would kind of have that power of a disruptive, disrupting business as usual, but raising demands that go beyond kind of what we're typically thought of as workplace demands. And of course, this is, yes, I mean, social movement unionism has been doing this on other issues for some time. That's great. If I not seeing Jeff or Esther wanting to immediately jump in, we're going to go, I think Lena has some questions she wants to relate and some people that are ready to speak from our live audience.
Yes. So I believe Nicole Braun, who's an awesome regular at Shelter in Solidarity, has some things to say. And then also Linda Liu, who's a co-producer. So we could go to Nicole if you want to unmute and go ahead, and then to Linda, and then we can have the guests speak. Nicole? Oh, yes, I can unmute you.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad to be here today. This is something that matters to me and to so many people. And just listening to all of it, I've been taking notes, and I really appreciate everything. I think I want to tell, if you don't mind, a little bit about my background. So I've been trying to work actually on writing a piece about student loan debt, which I think Jason knows and Joe knows. And I've really been struggling with it. I have so much to say, but I also have, even though I know intellectually that I should not, like, so much internalized shame about the debt and the way that it sort of played out in my life. So, a little bit of background about me. When I was 17, I left home. And then I was living in Flint, Michigan, and living a very sort of, depressing existence. And I wound up pregnant. And then my friends said to go to school. So I never even thought I could go to college, but I really wanted to. And so I somehow figured out, with the help of a lot of people, to go to University of Michigan, Flint. And it changed my life, and I loved it. And I graduated, the commencement speaker at my graduation. And then, my professors kept encouraging me, oh, you're so smart. You can do this, you can do that. You can get a PhD in sociology. And so I didn't even really know how to do anything because I wasn't from an academic background. I had family that, understood any of this or were supportive of education. So I wound up getting accepted to Rutgers. And I was told, my professors at U of M told me, oh, you'll get funding, you'll have your, your school paid for, you won't have to take out any loans, you'll have, then you get your PhD. And, that's sort of what the plan was. But when I went to Rutgers, it was sort of a culture shock because of the class difference, and I never got any funding. But it was such a huge leap for me to go from Flint to Rutgers, which maybe sounds a little silly now when I'm talking about it. But, my friends were so enthused that somebody like me, or them, like I was the lucky one who got to go to Rutgers. They had a fundraiser for me to move. I got to New Jersey with my son in tow. And then when I was there, I never got any funding at all. So I just kept taking out loans because I didn't feel like I had any other option but to go back. But I was convinced that, because people believed in me as an undergraduate for the first time in my life, that I would be able to do something with my life. And I thought, I would wind up with a PhD and then a tenure-track job. And so I couldn't face the shame of going back. So that's one of the reasons why I kept taking out the loans. But Rutgers just let me take out loan after loan after loan. And so I'm buried in debt. And so one of the things that happened when I left Rutgers, I was so angry that I just kept writing to them, over my dead body, are you getting a piece of my money until I get a piece of the American dream, which obviously really wasn't the best thing to do. But anyway, so then since then, I've basically been an adjunct professor for 22 years. So now I feel like, if I would have had that full-time, tenure track position, that, I would have even been able to pay back the loans. But because of so many of us are adjuncts and part-time faculty, we're just buried in debt. We're making poverty wages. We have no health benefits. I mean, there's all these pieces going on. And then we're sort of participating in the reproduction of inequality, because I have all these students who are working class or poor that believe the very same things that I did, that education is their ticket out, when it clearly isn't, because of the way that the educational system is structured. So I think, when I'm trying to write this piece, there's a part of me that really understands, intellectually, all the things that everybody's talking about here, with the larger issues of debt. But I also still struggle personally with the shame because of the ways that I was socialized, even though I would like to deconstruct it. And then so how to write this article, or or how to even talk about any of these things to, you know, many of my friends who never even went to college just think, you know, it's all terrible that, you know, I would want to have my debt eradicated, but I haven't been able to buy a house, you know, like, I mean, all the things that it's just ruined my life. And now I'm 55 years old. So anyway, like, I hope that's not too much information. But I just, you know, I guess I'm just trying to wonder for myself, what are the strategies? What can we do? How to talk to people who are so resistant to the idea that student loan debt should be eradicated when they haven't even gone to college. So these are the things that I'm sort of thinking about, some of the things.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that, Nicole. So I think we will just go right to Linda, and then we'll have the guests just respond to both at the same time. So you can go right ahead, Linda.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks Astra, Jeff, and Jason for this great conversation so far. So my question actually has to do with kind of the trend of private companies offering student loan repayments as kind of job benefits to their employees. And so apparently a growing number of employers are doing so in response to the end of the federal pause on loan repayments this August. So in the mainstream press, this is being characterized as a bid on the part of employers to attract and retain workers in a challenging job market, with increasingly emboldened, that's their word, workers. So what do you think the effects might be on debtor and worker organizing, as well as attitudes towards the private sector's role in debt relief?
Great questions. Who wants to step in? There's a lot on the table there.
Is it okay if I step in, because I'm going to have to go soon?
That makes sense, right? You had the hard stop.
Yeah.
Thank you, Astra.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I'd have to read more, Linda, about what you're just saying, but we are seeing employers offering kind of debt payments and debt mitigation as benefits, you know, I mean, and it's, I mean, this is a very incoherent thought, but it's like when things are so shitty, entities can then take advantage of them by like kind of ameliorating their effects of it, right? Like, oh, you're buried in student debt. Well, we'll help you make your payments. I know that, you know, that's one of the perks. I think if you work as a staffer on the Hill, you know, you get X hundred of dollars, you know, a few $100 a month to pay your debts. I mean, even this is to go to the theme of like labor and debtor organizing, you know, one thing that the teachers unions offer as like a membership for their a membership benefit is, you know, we'll help you navigate the bureaucracy that is public service loan forgiveness, a program that has rejected 99.9% of its applicants. And it's like, you know, in other words, like for me, from my radical position of solidarity, I'm like, no, what you should be is all in the fight to abolish all this debt and restructure education, instead of being like, hey, one of our member benefits is we'll help you navigate this completely ridiculous system that arbitrarily determines, you know, who's done public service and who hasn't. So I don't know. I think this is why it's such a, you know, we are seizing this moment where some tiny amount of student debt cancellation is on the table with Biden to try to really reach out to labor unions and build the base, open space for dialogue, so that we can hopefully build together moving forward. Because I think there could be so much powerful collaboration here. And I really hope that people read this wonderful piece by one of our collaborators, Hannah Palin-Jacobin, that's on worker and debtor organizing. Because I think what she does there too is actually highlight how workers and debtors, as though those are separate categories, one thing, but actually can share a lot of the same targets. I mean, Amazon obviously is a set of intense labor organizing right now, but they also offer credit cards, right? They're also offering financial services. So what if holders of Amazon credit cards withheld their payments in solidarity or something like that with workers? Like what kind of, when you start looking at the way these two realms are interlinked, what new strategies could develop? So I'm bullish on potential collaboration there. To Nicole's point, I just want to say that, again, it was another great example of the testimony and the power of debtor storytelling. I think that, you know, when And we always wrestle with the fact that these people are put in a situation where they have to make impossible choices. So in my film, You Are Not Alone, that Joe mentioned, Hannah Pell, who I just mentioned as the author of that piece, there's a scene where some of the people who went on this Corinthian debt strike, and this is before it was totally successful, it was sort of half successful at the time, are talking about making the choice to not pay because they were already suffering the worst consequences of default. And Hannah says, I'm a founder of this movement and I'm not ready to not pay because the stakes are so high for me, because they have their claws in me. I have to put groceries on the credit card at the end of the month, even as a professor, and I can't afford to blow this up. And so we're always trying to, not lose sight of the personal, not lose sight of the impossible bind that folks are put in and the shame of it. And as far as strategies, I don't know. We've come a far way in the last decade by just relentlessly talking about this issue. I think we do need to shift the frame. For me and my talking points with people, it's like try to consciously shift people out of the individual mindset. There are lots of ways that debt cancellation will benefit people who don't have student debt, right? And so I don't have student debt, but I will benefit from the economic stimulus that it will bring, right? From people being able to spend more money on things in their community. I will benefit from, yes, supposedly rich, but not rich. I will benefit from doctors getting their debts canceled because they will be able to go and be family physicians and not have to pursue the wage maximizing profession. I will benefit from lawyers getting their debts canceled because then they can be public defenders and serve the public good and not go work for Exxon. And I think so we need to constantly just be reinserting the social into this conversation as we do a lot of myth busting about who has student debt and who doesn't, and what good it serves. I'm so tired of having to justify student debt cancellation. I just want to turn the tables and be like, justify the status quo. Like this is what good comes of keeping people in debt for education when a lot of the people in power who are older, we are in something that resembles a gerontocracy at this moment, did not have to suffer through the same thing. Joe Biden gave a commencement speech a few Saturdays ago, the University of Delaware, and he was like, it was hard for me too, paying that $300 a year in tuition, which adjusted for inflation was like $2,700. And so bringing a little historical perspective into the debate, I think is also really useful. Like these are not etched in stones. I know we're being ruled by originalists now, but it doesn't say in the Constitution that you have to go into student debt to get an education. Historical perspective and bringing in the social and just being relentless about telling your story. So never apologize for it. I think just tell it, because what you'll find out is a lot of people can relate, and also prompt them to, maybe if they don't have student debt, they have medical debt, they're struggling with their rent, and try to build that solidarity through storytelling and join the Debt Collective.
Thank you so much.
Last thing I want to do is I do want to post because you mentioned, not paying, I'm going to have to find it really quick, but I'm going to post in the chat a thing about joining the strike, because we have a payment pause that is scheduled to end August 31st. And the Debt Collective is organizing a strike, a non-payment. And we have thought really carefully about this. We do not want people to take unnecessary risk. Financial suicide is not a debt strike. And so this will talk about all of the ways that you can kind of get to $0 non-payment, as safely as possible, and what the options are there. So I'm going to find that link, put it in the chat, and then I'm going to log out. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Astra. Thank you for giving us your time today on this Saturday, this very busy weekend, I'm sure, for many of us. And you have a hard stop. We will continue the conversation till about 3 o'clock Eastern Standard as well. But thank you, just everyone. If you could give a little virtual applause to Astra before she winks off our screen. Hope to continue the conversation, Astra, and with the Debt Collective as well. The point about historical reference, I think, is really important. I never fail, as my little one piece of anti-debt pedagogy, to inform every student I ever teach at UMass Boston that when the school opened in 1967, I believe, downtown Boston, before they confined us to Columbia Point, where there used to be a trash heap before then, nonetheless, it was only $100 a year. I'm sorry, $100 a semester to go to UMass Boston. equivalent of like $1,400 adjusted for tuition. So again, similar $2,700 a year. I never fail to ask my students, how would your educational experience and your life be different if the tuition were still at that level? And that does always create some of that room for reflection about how things could be different that maybe Jason was referring to a moment ago. Just one other thought on Linda's question. Actually, Jeff Williams, I want to know if you might want to speak to Linda's question about kind of private companies, whether after graduation or before, like stepping in to, offer some kind of debt relief, this kind of austerity privatization relation dialectic that kind of gets going, right? Where the private sphere gets to be the savior right after, because the public has just let something get so bad. Even though, of course, private interests have played a big role in letting it and making it get so bad in the first place. I thought maybe your expertise might speak to Linda's question, since, yeah.
Well, there are some companies that offer debt abatement if you work for like 3 years, but also, they pay for graduate school. I know somebody who became an accountant and they got sent to UVA for like a year and a half or something like that. But the thing is, those are high-end, high-paying jobs so I don't think that that's the answer. I mean, I think that the irony is for us what Astra was talking about debt about formal forgiveness, that actually, I always thought it was an irony. About 20 years ago, I researched that congressional aides evidently are forgiven after 5 years. So that spearheaded public service. And it's like, so in their own precincts, they themselves negotiated for their own forgiveness. And, I think it's actually admirable if you were to work for Congress, presumably for a government. I'm not anti-government in that way. It just should be a different kind of government. But so I mean, there is a precedent for forgiveness. But actually, one question I want to ask you, or maybe Jason could talk about this too. The one thing I have trouble answering people now is that, even some people in my own family who have, they might have different politics, but it's also some people are, they paid their own debt. And they say there's two things I run up against. And one is that, as I mentioned before, I busted my ass to get through college. I hardly took any loans. These other people took $100,000. And then the other thing is, even people who I feel like are more on the liberal side of things, they're like tisking at like one of my graduate students has 3 masters and has more than 100,000 in debt. It's like, well, why did they get 3 masters? It's like, it was just foolish. Maybe they should have stopped at 1, or they have a master's, addiction or something like that. So how do you answer those questions? Because they're not irrational, and they're questions I think that we have to answer. I mean, at first, the first time I actually heard it, the second one, I was, I just said, well, this is like a conservative talking point, and I'm not going to answer, but that was not a satisfactory answer. So it's part of self-correction.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear Lena's thoughts on this as well as Jason's, as from the organizing standpoint. I mean, I'll just say I have also encountered this from even former students who I considered quite progressive or radical, but who, fit that profile, right? And to some degree have internalized that sense of, that they worked through it, whereas other people may have taken.
Well, and then the personal responsibility thing is kind of draconian, because that's why people shouldn't have welfare, et cetera, et cetera.
Of course,
still,
slippery slope.
What do you do when somebody has, in fact, gotten 3 fairly expensive masters, and that they did have that is actually a choice. I mean, they were obviously hoping for something better to come of it.
Yeah. I mean, I have thoughts on this, but I'd rather hear from Lena. Lena, as having identified with that position of the student who's worked through and thus have avoided debt. But also Jason, from an organizing standpoint in the Debt Collective, what would you say to the person that or the profile that Jeff is reflecting to us?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually going to ask a question next about that kind of way of thinking about it, because I saw this poll recently from Inside Higher Ed that kind of on, support for student debt among both borrowers and people who aren't currently in debt, and just trying to understand like the apathy and from people who aren't in debt, and then also just like, trying to grapple with why someone who's in debt wouldn't automatically support like debt relief, or at least partial debt relief. So yeah, it's sort of mind-boggling to me as well. And it was going to be one of my next questions. But yeah, I'd love to hear what Jason had to say about it, if he has anything.
Yeah, so this comes up a lot, both these points, and I guess I'll address the one question about I paid off my debt, so everyone should have to pay off their debt. I mean, I think it makes, there is a certain argument to that. I do think, you know, like one way to respond to that is to say, well, if I suffer through something terrible, that doesn't mean that everybody should have to do so. So, you know, if I had COVID, it doesn't mean that I want everyone to go through COVID, and then that would be a just society. Or, you know, if I walk down onto the corner and someone knocks me across the head and takes my wallet, then I want everyone to have the same experience. To me, that's a distorted view of justice. But again, it takes a lot of time to overcome the dominant ethics, right? I think the question about the master's degree is an interesting one. It made me think about something that I was thinking about earlier as we were talking. I think one of the dangers that we fall into in making the cancellation argument is that we often fall in, you know, we make economic arguments for it. And I think in a certain way, we remain within a neoliberal paradigm sometimes. And you know, I wrote a piece about this before about like, what would it mean to make an argument for it's good for education? Like, I think the arguments are clear why cancellation is good for for economic individual and otherwise it's political, so on and so forth. But I think there is something that is said about, is there a way to make an argument where we transform the way that people think about the value of education? And do we reinscribe a certain logic when we make economic arguments for it? I mean, I think we're always going to have to do that given the circumstances, but I do think there's that danger. And I think Rich actually addressed part of that question in the chat where he mentioned that, you know, part of the logic there is that it's limited by a neoliberal paradigm. You know, technically, why shouldn't you be able to get 3 degrees if you want to get 3 degrees? And why should you have to go broke and go into debt to get them? I mean, what, you know, again, this serves who and this serves what? So I think like there's a larger ideological issue there that we hopefully can somehow address, although I'm not optimistic about that one. You know, I do think at least it opens up a question to rethink the value of education and why we value it.
Yeah, that seems really important to reframe in that way. I mean, why, especially at least when we're dealing with, let's say we say, so, and I understand these terms could be debated what this term means, but just, you know, bracketing that, like if the jobs that people are being trained for or prepared for, and also frankly the citizenship in the, you know, universal sense of the term, the enlightened citizenship of being a member of a democratic polity, if these are considered essential and necessary, then why the hell should people have to go into debt? Why should we punish people for, you know, doing what's necessary to reproduce society, both in the sense of having doctors and nurses and perhaps even some lawyers, teachers, and so forth. I mean, I guess this is the logic behind the kind of public service loan forgiveness, that kind of existing, non-existent, bureaucratically barred program. But it seems to me that could be extended more generally, right? Why should people to be trained to do things that society needs and to be educated to become the kind of guides, the stewards of society that society needs? Why should people have to go into debt and be punished for that at all? It seems to me that, I mean, that's not necessarily going so far as to say, hey, if you want to just do 3 masters out of your own curiosity, then that's fine. But I think we should make that argument too. But at the very least, the argument from like social usefulness seems to be, could be quite radical if taken seriously. At least that's one argument I'm comfortable making and find myself making often. I see a couple people nodding. I don't know if Jeff wants to jump on this. Actually, Rich is ready to speak as well. Rich, who was just alluded to a moment ago. Rich Levy's on the call here. Rich, would you like to jump in since you were invoked? Just unmute yourself or ask. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Yeah.
I'm Rich Levy. I'm retired from Salem State, but I've been working with Jason and some other folks on a campus debt reveal. And it's important in this context as a means of organizing. Part of the expansion of student debt has come from the amount of money that universities are now forced to borrow to build buildings, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. And this expands student debt. The research we've shown, we've done all 13 public campuses in Massachusetts, and it's about 25% of tuition is campus debt, 25% of student debt when they graduate comes directly from paying campus debt. Not only does that have the benefit of changing it from general debt to student debt, which can't be discharged through bankruptcy, but the organizing aspect of it is it's not transparent. And when students find out about it, it really does piss them off and get them involved in that larger conversation. There are methods of trying to pressure for more state funding, for your trustees to push for state funding. But what I found is that it's been really, really a useful motivator to get, because this is totally unknown on campus. This is what we call the invisible debt. Everybody knows about individual student debt. Virtually nobody knows about campus debt and the role between those two. So, it's really an important project. We've developed a method, a worksheet that you can analyze student debt and the costs in terms of tuition, faculty, courses, support staff. Those are all doable in like a fairly short period of time off of this worksheet. So if there's a way for me to get that to, Joe and Lena, I can get that information, or Jason has it as well, and make it available to anybody who's interested.
Absolutely, Rich. And being from the, originally from the North Shore myself, and actually we have regulars from Salem State who come on the show, I would love to follow up. I think it's important. I understand that the Debt Collective does organize locally, but with local, like geographically defined branches, as well as kind of nationally and virtually, right? So maybe Jason can say a little more about that as well, and how people can plug in. We do have about 13 minutes left in the show, so we'll take another round of questions, hopefully, as well as give you a chance for closing statements. But Lena, do you want to ask a question or speak to this?
I don't have a question right now, but I'm not sure if anyone else in the audience has anything, or if you do, Joe.
Well, I can say this to Rich's. I mean, at UMass Boston, we've been forced to become very aware of the way institutional debt, hangs like an oppressive weight on the whole institution, including students. And I mean, I think as faculty, budget cuts justified by essentially, kind of paying for what do they call it? Depreciation on buildings, right? But the kind of right, which is on the budget as a major cost, which is to say, basically the prorated a per year cost of what replacing the building will cost in 40 years when it needs replacement, right? But the subtext of that is that basically this is at a public institution, or at least a nominally public institution, right? The subtext of that is you can't depend on the state to pay for the next building, even though they built this one, right? So in the subtext of depreciation showing up on a public institution's budget as a must-pay billion-dollar, million-dollar, multi-million-dollar item per year, right? That ends up basically smuggling a privatized future into the public institution. And so it was several years ago, Linda and I kind of brought together as organizers, Linda Liu, co-producers of the show, right, by organizing against budget cuts and massive layoffs at UMass Boston. But one thing we discovered is that basically, if depreciation was taken off of our books, right, and there's a whole debate about whether depreciation should even be on public books in the first place, right? My understanding is that the origin of it has to do with it was private companies' way of avoiding taxes by creating additional expenditures that weren't really immediate actual expenditures, so that they could kind of dodge tax liability. But in the public realm, we don't benefit from avoiding tax liability. In fact, quite the opposite. Anyway, I don't want to go too much into the woods on this, but I do think, a lot of our, at least in Massachusetts, and I'm sure elsewhere, our state institutions are suffering from a version of this, right? And I think it's very important to help people decode, right, these budgets as political, ideological, moral arguments or immoral arguments, and really to kind of demystify some of these expenses that make it seem like they have to cut jobs or they can't increase wages, when really really that's a political argument, not a statement about the the state of nature and gravity on campus. So anyway, I think we should definitely talk more across campuses about this thing, because they really do require action at the level of the state, right, to fund our campus's infrastructure, so that we don't have to privatize the raising of those funds, whether it's from students, from ratcheting up workloads, right, laying off people, increasing the student faculty ratio for those who are able to afford to be on campus at all. anyway, I'll stop going there, but I think that's very important. And I understand that, maybe Jason would like to step into that. I know the Debt Collective is doing more work on institutional debt as well as international debt here, as Astra said earlier, not just a student debt organization, and certainly not just an individual student debt organization. Jason?
Yeah, and honestly, it's the Debt Collective in collaboration with the Public Higher Education Workers Group of Labor Notes and other groups as well in different areas of the country. And I think the point about institutional debt is really important, and it gets us to this other question that we talk a lot about, which is to say that, this is like Wolfgang Streeck's argument, is that we moved from a tax state to a debt state, and during the neoliberal period, which is to, whereas we used to fund certain public goods through taxes on individuals and corporations and other ways, we now rely on debt to do that. And that debt is at the K through 12 level. It's for water, it's for transportation, it's for basic, you name it. And, ultimately that ends up adding costs to our own individual lives, and it really delimits what institutions can do, education and otherwise. And so, again, we're in this, this larger question of political economy and how do we remake that. I do think though that to make these connections is really important across the different debt types, and to always keep the focus, I think, on the ways in which we build power. I think we haven't talked too much about power, although you brought it up with leverage, Joe. It just seems to me at this point like the rational arguments and all the economic arguments in the world are not going to win the day. I think they would have already, at least for full debt cancellation in the case of student debt. So I do think that at some point we're going to have to discuss how to escalate and what it will look like to build power and then flex muscle, because I'm very cynical, especially after yesterday, and I kind of think it's just very clear to me right now that they really don't want to cancel the debt because they know it's a form of social control. And they know it's a way that the other thing to say is they know it's a way to guarantee labor for capital. And I think that's something that we always need to remember, that debt is a way to guarantee labor for capital. And if you want to make sure that you can force workers back into the job market under shitty terms for low wages, make sure they're in debt. And I think they don't say this out loud, but I think if there's two main reasons why they really don't want to cancel it, it has to do with giving the capitalist class a benefit in labor negotiations. And it's a way of keeping down protests and other forms of manifestations in the street and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful point, Jason. Absolutely. Again, returning us to the social control and the fundamentally political, not just Democratic, Republican, but kind of class power subtext, and not just subtext, but kind of function of these debt chains. It's not just a financial arrangement; it's a political and economic, but political kind of power play, and which is just another reason that we need to resist it, find ways to build the power to abolish these chains, or at least slacken them, so we can have a better chance to swing both our fists, metaphorically speaking. Lena, did you? I know you had a couple of questions that didn't have a chance to come in here. Before we wrap up, I'd love it if you could ask if you have anything else. And I think Nicole wanted to say something too, right? So, but Lena, I'll pass it to you, and then maybe we can take a last comment from after Nicole from Jason and Jeff.
Yeah, I can start. Well, I think Jason, you just kind of started talking about this already, but just to kind of end on a hopeful note, just asking what we can do right now, and it's such an important political moment that we're in right now, in terms of student debt. What can people do right now? What is the Debt Collective doing right now as well, and how can people kind of get involved in it? If you want to say anything to that, and then if Nicole has anything to say, she can go ahead as well.
Okay, I just will really briefly state that I noticed the other day on Alan's Facebook page, a lot of people were giving testimony, and they were talking about how they felt suicidal and they were so depressed because of the debt. And so I was just thinking about, we're talking about the economic impact, but also just the emotional and psychological impact and the toll that it takes on people's health, the student loan debt and debt in general, but over time. And maybe that's just another way to sort of talk about the debt too, is just the psychological consequences, because what happens when we have a society where so many people are sort of like thinking that their only way out of debt is death, essentially. So that's what I have to say. It's not actually very hopeful, but just something I wanted to point out.
Thank you, Nicole. Always bringing very, very important perspective to this conversation. All right, so Lena had a question. I think I'd just like to, kick Lena's comment and Nicole's back to Jason and Jeff just one more time, and also we're gonna listen to a little piece of music which the Debt Collective member has actually provided us for today. Someone who couldn't be here in person. But I'm gonna ask Jason to maybe frame that for us, so we can kind of go out on a musical note, not false optimism, but deep, powerful words that can help us to power through these in many ways dark times. Why don't we go to Jeff first, and then Jason, and then we will go to our closing song.
Good, thanks. Actually, two points I want to make in closing, to close, but that one ties to what Jason was saying about social control. I mentioned earlier about indentured servitude. When I researched actual historical indentured, I was really struck with the fact, we think the early founding of America was like, religious liberty, or maybe just explorers and adventurers or something like that. But actually 1/2 to 2/3 of people who came to these shores came under indentured servitude from, I think, 1636 to whatever, until they replaced it with slavery in 1680. But most people on these shores were indentured servants, and 2/3 of people who go to college now have student debt. So I think that that's a resonance that's particularly striking. And part of the reason why indentured servitude in the US was different, it was a normal like apprenticeship sort of thing in the UK because it was 1 year, but because of the cost of transport. So it's transport to a job, just like the way that student debt is usually called. It's also was much more lengthened terms because it was very expensive to do. It mostly affected the young, although that's not quite as true anymore. It was very prevalent. It was government sanctioned and controlled. There were industries that grew up around it. There were shippers in the UK who sent indentured servants and there were Sally Mae or shippers. So I think it's worth looking at those resonances just as an historical touch point, because it's not foreign to that. And the second point I wanted to make, the one thing that I would say that I did this survey of studentloanjustice.org where they have all these personal accounts. And that's part of, I was playing a lawyer. If I were to assemble accounts about liability because of the harm that it caused, there are, more than 500 accounts. They had to actually they had to close it down because they had so many accounts. And Debt Collective and various other sources have collected accounts. They're often sporadic, but there are many accounts. But just the pain, suffering, it so permeates your life. As I mentioned before, we think it's like, the loan book you have for a car, or, the thing you just go on your computer and do your daily loan thing. You just think it's a bill, like sending my rent check every month. Whereas it so permeates your life and how you feel in all of the accounts about depression. And it's also many people with decent jobs who have worked for a long time and, also it's particularly pernicious if other debt befalls them. What I mean is it's so pervasive and permeates their lives and is, it's a feeling. It's not just this technical relationship, but it so permeates their lives. We can talk about interpellation, but it's even different than that. It so fills people's lives. And that's particularly why it's not acceptable. So, Jason.
Yeah, so I just want to say again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show, and especially with Jeff and Astra and other people that I mentioned earlier. I've learned a ton from over the years, so this has been great. And I think everyone that listened in and the questions. A couple things, at Debt Collective, we say, and I think this has come up, alone our debts are a burden, together they give us power. And so really it is almost cliche, but we do need to come together as debtors and recognize ourselves as debtors without any shame or guilt and say, this debt is not just, and the people that did the wrong thing and should feel guilty are the people that put us in this position in the first place. Because there's no way that you should have to live by surviving on debt. That is a creation, as Joe mentioned earlier, that's not natural, that is done on purpose. This is policy. And so there needs to be something done about that. And we can only do something done about that collectively. So a plug to join the Debt Collective. I would also say we're at a moment right now, and we know this, that there is either a misconception, willful or not, I'm not sure, but who knows, that debt is not a working, quote unquote, working class issue, student debt in particular. And this is a really dominant narrative. And so if you are involved in labor in any way, shape, or form, to try and get your labor groups to support full debt cancellation and make that public in as many ways as possible. We've worked with Chicago Teachers Union, United Teachers of Los Angeles to sign full debt cancellation resolutions. If you're interested in stuff like that, getting your labor union to sign a resolution, to doing op-eds, to doing other actions, we would love to talk to you. So there is an actual real need right now to fight back against the narrative that says that debt cancellation only benefits rich people. It's not a labor issue. We need to push back against that. Getting your union to join would be one of the ways. If you need help with that, we can do debt assemblies with your union. As Joe mentioned as well, and this will be the segue into the music, Debt Collective does has local branches or chapters. If you're interested in setting up a local chapter or branch, again, on the website, we can help you do that. One of our strongest ones is here in Philadelphia, where we've had some really successful direct actions, where we've organized against not only student debt, but lunch debt, which, believe it or not, exists in this country in some really pernicious ways. And one of our we're very intentional about intersectional, broad, coalition-based building. And so we've been building with the community here in Philadelphia. One of our key organizers is Tamara Anderson, who is an educator, an actor, and an artist. And Tamara prepared a song for this show. She wanted to be here, but she had a second gig. And we're going to share this song. And I think this is another way to think about anti-debt pedagogy through this aesthetics, like through arts. And art is a way to create a pedagogy against the indebted life. And so what you're going to see is a song that Tamara prepared. And I guess we'll end with that. And thank you once again.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Turn me around. Turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking. Keep on marching, marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Hey, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on walking, marching till we're all dead free. Ain't gonna let no president turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no president turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on marching, marching till we're all dead free. Oh, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on walking, marching till we're all dead free. Not gonna let no hesitancy turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Not gonna let no hesitancy turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on walking till we get all dead free. Till we get all dead free, yeah. Till we get all dead free, yeah. Till we get all dead free, yeah.
And thank you, Tamara Anderson. Thank you, Jason Wozniak, for helping us to connect with Tamara, even in absentia, that she had to take another, I guess, paid gig today, as we got to survive, yo. Shelter in Solidarity is an all-volunteer project, as are our guests who are volunteering their time on at least what is here in Boston, a beautiful Saturday afternoon, despite the dark political clouds we are working with. Jason, thank you for being here so much on Shelter in Solidarity. We hope to have you back soon. And Jeff Williams, been working this train for so long. I've been, we're good friends for a long time, but I think this is the first time we've done anything on the record, live recorded together. It's an honor and a privilege to work with you, Jeff. And thanks for all the work you've done on this for years up to this point, even before it was a known cause the way it is now.
Thank you, everybody, for everything. Really appreciate the conversation.
Great, and we will continue it, and I will definitely reach out to Rich and you in terms of a Boston chapter and connecting. I was actually just down in Philly for a conference. Sorry I missed you all down there, but we'll have to do it again. Lena, thank you for co-hosting today. It's great to be working with you once again.
Thank you, Joe. It's been so great, and that was such a great, powerful way to end it. So, thank you, Jeff, Jason, Jeff. It's been awesome.
And you're living, breathing proof that even if someone did work their ass off through school to avoid that debt, while still managing their schoolwork, that it's possible to do that, and it's possible to also be on the side of debt abolition at the same time, right? Which I think is really crucial that you're modeling that. I'd like to thank everyone who's here today, and especially the co-producers of Shelter in Solidarity, including Lena Durkin, Linda Liu, Kira Mudliar, Seren Mudliar, and Mark Soderstrom. Please, if you have not already, visit us at shelterandsolidarity.org. That's shelterandsolidarity.org. Also, our Shelter and Solidarity group page on YouTube, which you can subscribe to and watch all of our 80 episodes that we've produced in the last 2 years and a couple months since this pandemic hit, at least on the East Coast of the United States. Also, check out our Facebook page, please like and follow that. Again, as an all volunteer effort at this point, we do depend on the word of mouth and your own social networks to help us spread the word about shows. We're taking a little bit of a break in terms of our weekly show. We will still have, actually, though, throughout the summer, a bookshelf, a weekend bookshelf, which you'll be able to find out more about on our website and our Facebook page and our email list soon. Finally, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Community Church of Boston, a free community for the study and practice of universal religion, Encuentro Cinco, affectionately known as E5, a movement building hub in downtown Boston, Hardball Press, a leading publisher of labor and social justice stories for adults and children. If you have a birthday or a holiday coming up for the young ones in your life, check out Hardball Press for some very inspiring labor and social justice literature for those little ones. The Liberty Tree Foundation, an organization serving for the democracy revolution and the democracy movement. And last but not least, Socialism and Democracy, a journal that brings together the worlds of scholarship and activism, theory and practice to examine in depth the core issues and popular movements of our time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and let's shed those unjust, absurd, and unnecessary debts together and start talking about and working to get the people who really owe the debts to the rest of society and to the working class and the oppressed in this society and beyond. Let's start the conversation about what they owe us, folks. Let's have that conversation, and Shelter in Solidarity is one place to have it. Hope to see you next time. Thank you all.